I am Grace, 32 years old, and a forensic accountant who just watched my parents give my entire inheritance to my spoiled cousin. They smirked as they handed over a $5 million portfolio and a Beacon Hill mansion, telling me I was the spinster who deserved nothing. I just smiled and signed as a witness. What they did not know was that I secretly owned every single asset they just tried to give away. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family. Growing up in Boston, my parents, Patricia and Richard, cared about one thing above all else: preserving their image among the elite. To them, appearances were currency. I was the quiet, analytical daughter who preferred spreadsheets to social climbing, which made me a constant disappointment. My cousin Madison, however, was their dream child. At 25, she was glamorous, loud, and constantly curating her life for social media. She had recently secured a proposal from the heir to a massive hotel empire, and my parents treated her like royalty. The ultimate betrayal unfolded on a rainy Tuesday afternoon inside a mahogany-paneled law office downtown. I had been summoned under the pretense of a routine family meeting. Instead, I walked into an execution of my future. My mother, Patricia, sat perfectly poised in her designer suit. My father, Richard, stood by the window, exuding unearned arrogance. Madison lounged in a leather chair, admiring her enormous engagement ring. Patricia tossed a thick legal document across the polished desk. The bold letters at the top read, "Living Trust." I glanced at the paperwork and then up at my mother. "Sign on the witness line, Grace," my mother commanded, not bothering with a greeting. "We are transferring the Beacon Hill estate and the $5 million investment portfolio entirely to Madison." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer audacity of the demand. "You are leaving everything to your niece. Madison needs these assets to secure her position," Patricia explained smoothly, as if she were discussing the weather. "She is marrying into a prominent hotel family next month. She needs to show them she comes from generational wealth. A proper dowry is essential for a girl with her social trajectory." "And me?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. Patricia let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Let us be realistic, Grace. You are 32, single, and wasting away in a cubicle doing accounting work. You have no social life, no prospects, and certainly no need for a mansion or millions of dollars. You earn a decent salary crunching numbers. That should be enough to sustain a solitary lifestyle." Madison twisted the flashy diamond on her finger, flashing me a condescending smirk. "Do not be bitter, Grace. Some of us are just built for high society. You would look completely ridiculous trying to host galas in Beacon Hill anyway. You should be happy for me. I am securing the family legacy." My father finally chimed in, crossing his arms. "The decision is final, Grace. Sign the document. We have a celebratory dinner to get to, and we cannot afford any delays. The groom's family expects proof of Madison's trust fund by the end of the week." Any normal person might have screamed out loud. I felt a familiar cold detachment wash over me. This was the same family that constantly belittled my career, mocking my choice to become a forensic accountant. They thought my job was boring compared to their networking events. They had no idea what my job actually entailed, or the power that came with tracking every single cent moving through the financial system. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. I did not shed a single tear or raise my voice. I simply offered them a pleasant, empty smile. "Of course, Mother," I said smoothly. "I would be absolutely delighted to witness this generous transfer." I flipped to the back page and signed my name on the witness line with a flourish. Madison beamed, letting out a little squeal of triumph. Patricia snatched the document back immediately, looking slightly annoyed that I had not given her the dramatic reaction she craved. "Good," Patricia snapped, sliding the papers into her briefcase. "You are excused, Grace. We have important wedding planning to discuss with the lawyers." I walked out of the office without another word. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside with their delusions of grandeur. I rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage and slid into the driver's seat of my Porsche. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the concrete structure. I pulled my phone from my bag and opened a highly secure encrypted financial portal used only for executive-level asset management. My fingers flew across the screen, navigating through a complex web of corporate holding structures. I found the specific limited liability company that controlled the Beacon Hill mansion and the $5 million investment portfolio. I tapped the screen 3 times, bringing up the master administrative controls. A prompt popped up asking for authorization to alter the account status. I hit the button labeled Freeze All Transfers and locked it behind a biometric security wall. A green checkmark appeared confirming the action was complete. The accounts were entirely immobilized. I leaned back against the leather seat and let out a soft laugh. My parents had spent so much time looking down on my career that they forgot one crucial, devastating legal detail about the assets they just proudly gave away. You cannot transfer property that you do not actually own. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to try and spend money they no longer had. I pulled out of the underground parking garage and merged into the heavy afternoon traffic of downtown Boston. Rain lashed against the windshield of my car, but inside the cabin the atmosphere was perfectly calm. I merged onto the highway, keeping my eyes fixed on the red taillights ahead of me. The dashboard display chimed with an incoming call. It was David, the senior legal compliance officer at my financial firm, and one of the few people who knew the full financial history of my family. I tapped the screen to answer, letting his voice fill the quiet space of the car. "Grace," David said, his tone clipped and professional. "I am looking at the alerts on the internal monitoring system. You just triggered a total administrative freeze on the primary holding accounts for the Beacon Hill properties and the associated investment portfolios. Are we initiating a full lockdown?" "Yes, David," I replied smoothly, navigating a sharp turn onto the main avenue. "Full lockdown. No funds go in, and absolutely no funds go out. Reject any transfer requests, wire attempts, or credit authorizations linked to the primary entity." "Understood," he said. I hear keyboard clicks in the background. Just to confirm for the audit log, the designated beneficiaries on the new trust document they drafted today have no authorized access. "They have zero access," I confirmed. "They just spent 2 hours with a high-priced lawyer drafting a living trust that attempts to transfer $5 million and a historic estate to my cousin Madison." David let out a low whistle. "They really think they can just sign away assets they handed over to you 7 years ago. They must have terrible memory or terrible legal counsel, probably both." It was not a memory lapse. It was sheer arrogance. 7 years ago, my parents were not the untouchable Boston elites they pretended to be. They were drowning in massive debt, facing imminent bankruptcy, and dodging the Internal Revenue Service for years of unpaid taxes. The federal government was preparing to seize everything they owned, including the mansion they loved more than their own daughter. I was 25 at the time, just starting my career as a forensic accountant, possessing a pristine credit score and an absolutely spotless financial record. They came to my tiny apartment in tears, begging me to save them. They needed a clean name to establish a limited liability company, a secure vault where they could hide their remaining wealth from the federal auditors. They transferred the deed to the Beacon Hill estate and every cent of their liquid investments into that company. In their panic to protect their wealth from the government, they willingly made me the sole executive owner of the entire holding structure. They assumed I would just act as a silent, obedient puppet who would hold their money and hand it back whenever they snapped their fingers. They never bothered to read the fine print of the operating agreement I drafted for them. The documents legally cemented me as the 100% owner of the entity. They handed me the keys to their kingdom and assumed my loyalty to the family would keep me compliant. "Are you expecting them to challenge the freeze?" David asked, pulling me back to the present moment. "They will try," I said, accelerating past a slow-moving truck. "But they have absolutely no leverage. Any legal challenge they mount would require them to admit in open court that they hid assets to evade federal tax collection. If they sue me, they expose themselves to the IRS, and they would face immediate federal prison time for tax fraud. They are completely trapped and they do not even realize it yet." I pulled into the private parking structure of my corporate office building, the tires squeaking slightly on the slick concrete. I parked in my spot and killed the engine. The silence returned heavy and satisfying. "I will flag all their connected accounts for maximum security," David said. If anyone tries to move even a single dollar from those portfolios to Madison, the system will instantly deny the transaction and flag it as unauthorized activity. Good luck, Grace. Let me know when the fireworks start. I ended the call and sat in the car for a moment, letting the reality of the situation settle over me. For my entire life, my parents had treated me like a burden, an embarrassing footnote in their grand social narrative. They had weaponized their wealth, using it to control, belittle, and manipulate everyone around them. They thought they could simply write me out of their lives with a stroke of a pen and hand my rightful inheritance to a cousin who spent her days taking selfies and shopping on their dime. But their new living trust was effectively a worthless piece of paper. It held no legal weight because the assets it detailed belonged entirely to my holding company. I picked up my phone to double-check the security protocols on the banking app. Every single account linked to my parents and the estate now displayed a bright red locked icon. The safety net they thought they had carefully constructed for Madison was gone. The millions of dollars they planned to use to impress her new billionaire husband were completely inaccessible. Just as I was about to step out of the car, my phone vibrated in my hand. The screen illuminated with a new text message. I glanced down and saw the sender name. It was my older sister, Nicole. She was 35, married, and entirely dependent on our parents for her comfortable lifestyle. Unlike me, she had always played along with their toxic games, nodding and smiling to secure her place in the will. I opened the message and read the words glowing on screen. Dinner at Le Petit to celebrate the inheritance of Madison tonight. Do not be late and do not look poor. I just smiled peacefully. Le Petit was a Michelin-starred restaurant where waitstaff memorized your net worth before offering a table. I handed my coat to the hostess and walked into the private dining room my parents had booked for the occasion. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, illuminating the smug faces of my family. They were already seated, laughing loudly and radiating the toxic entitlement I had spent my entire life trying to escape. My mother, Patricia, was holding court at the head of the table, her diamond necklace catching the light with every dramatic movement of her hands. Next to her sat my father, Richard, aggressively gesturing to a sommelier who looked thoroughly exhausted by his demands. My older sister, Nicole, sat across from them, nodding eagerly at whatever Patricia was saying, desperate as always for a crumb of maternal approval. Beside Nicole sat her husband, Jamal. At 36 years old, Jamal was a successful structural engineer, a brilliant African-American man who grew up in a hard-working household. He was the only person at this table with an ounce of common sense, and the look of sheer exhaustion on his face told me he was already entirely over this evening. Then there was the guest of honor. Madison sat at the center of the table, sipping champagne and practically shoving her left hand into the faces of everyone so they could admire her engagement ring. The diamond was gaudy, chosen for maximum social media impact rather than actual elegance. "Ah, the lonely spinster finally joins us," Patricia announced as I took the empty seat next to Jamal. "I see you did not have time to change out of your work clothes. How tragic for you." I gently smoothed the lapels of my tailored black blazer, choosing not to mention that my suit cost more than her entire outfit. "I had to finish an audit, Mother. Some of us actually work for our money." Richard waved his hand dismissively, cutting off any further conversation. "We are not talking about your dreary office job tonight, Grace. We are celebrating Madison." He turned back to the sommelier. "Bring us 3 bottles of the Chateau Margaux, the vintage we requested earlier. Do not make me wait." I watched the sommelier nod tightly and walk away. I knew that specific wine. It was over $500 a bottle. Richard was spending money with the reckless abandon of a man who firmly believed his pockets had just been lined with $5 million in fresh trust fund cash. I picked up my water glass, hiding a small, genuine smile. Watching them celebrate their imaginary wealth was the best entertainment I had experienced in years. The dinner proceeded exactly as I expected. Course after course of incredibly expensive food was paraded out while the family took turns showering Madison with compliments. They praised her upcoming marriage to the hotel heir, discussing the elaborate engagement party they planned to host at the Beacon Hill mansion. They spoke about the estate as if they had built it with their own bare hands, conveniently ignoring the fact that it only belonged to my holding company because they had run their own finances into the ground. "So Grace," Madison said loudly, her voice cutting through the dining room, "I heard you are still working at that same financial firm. It must be so exhausting being a glorified calculator. Do you ever wish you had chosen a path that actually required some social grace or ambition?" Nicole giggled nervously, glancing at our mother to make sure she was reacting correctly. Patricia smiled, clearly delighted by the insult. "It is honest work," Jamal interjected, his deep voice carrying a tone of firm warning. "Grace is highly respected in her field. You all should be proud of her accomplishments instead of mocking her." Richard scoffed, waving a piece of truffle-topped steak on his silver fork. "Please, Jamal, she counts the money of other people for a living. It is hardly a legacy we can brag about at the country club." Madison, on the other hand, is elevating this family to an entirely new social echelon. The trust fund we finalized today guarantees she will enter her marriage as an equal partner. I kept my face perfectly still. I did not defend my career or point out the glaring irony of Richard insulting the very profession that had kept him out of federal prison 7 years ago. I just let them talk. I watched them order another round of expensive appetizers. I watched Madison brag about the luxury yacht she planned to rent for her bachelorette party. I watched them build a towering castle made of glass, knowing I already held the hammer that was going to shatter it into a million pieces. As the evening finally began to wind down, the reality of their excess was laid bare on a small silver tray. The waiter approached Richard, placing the leather bill folder discreetly next to his elbow. Richard picked it up, opening the flap and casually glancing at the total. Even from across the table, I could clearly see the number printed at the bottom of the receipt: $4,000. Richard did not flinch. He did not pull out his wallet. Instead, he slid the leather folder straight down the polished wood of the table until it stopped directly in front of my plate. I slowly looked down at the staggering receipt sitting on the table, then straight up at my father. His expression was a mask of entitled expectation. "You are paying for this tonight, Grace," Richard said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Consider it your congratulatory gift to your cousin. You have no husband to care for, no children to feed, and no real family of your very own to spend your money on. It is the absolute least you can do to repay the people who generously raised you." The silence in the private dining room became absolute. The clinking of forks stopped. Every eye locked onto me. They expected me to pull out my credit card and quietly subsidize their extravagant delusion just to avoid a public scene. Richard leaned back, swirling the last drops of his wine, satisfied with himself. Madison smiled, adjusting her posture so the light would catch her diamond perfectly. She looked at me with pure pity. Patricia crossed her arms, waiting for me to obey the hierarchy. Only Jamal looked horrified. He shifted his weight, gripping the edge of the table, preparing to intervene. I caught his eye and gave him a microscopic shake of my head. I did not need rescuing. I had been waiting patiently for this exact moment all evening. I reached for my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to my untouched dessert. Then I stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored blazer and picked up my designer handbag. I reached inside to pull out a single crisp $50 bill. The air in the private room grew heavy with sudden confusion. Richard frowned. Patricia uncrossed her arms. I held the $50 bill up so the entire table could see it. Then I let it fall. It fluttered down, landing perfectly on top of the black leather folder sitting in front of my father. "This covers my sparkling water," I said, my voice completely level. "And the tip for the excellent service. As for the rest of this $4,000 feast, you can figure that out yourselves." I turned my gaze directly to my cousin, who was staring at the bill like it was a grenade. "Congratulations on your imaginary wealth, Madison." For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. The sheer shock of my defiance temporarily paralyzed them. Then the inevitable explosion finally happened. Patricia slammed her hands flat against the table, knocking over her water goblet. The water spilled across the white tablecloth. She shot up from her chair, her face turning a deep shade of red. "How dare you!" Patricia screamed, abandoning her carefully crafted high society persona. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat. You are going to sit back down right now and pay this bill. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire restaurant. I looked at her entirely unbothered by her volume. I am not embarrassing you, Mother. You are embarrassing yourself. You ordered thousands of dollars worth of food and wine you cannot afford, expecting me to bail you out like I always do. Those days are officially over. You want to celebrate a fake trust fund. You can pay for it with your own money. Richard stood up next, pointing a thick finger at my face. You will not disrespect your mother like this. You will pay this bill right now, Grace, or you will regret it. I highly doubt that I replied smoothly. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good luck with the check. I turned my back and walked toward the exit. Madison started whining loudly about how I was ruining her special night. Patricia was screeching my name, demanding I come back. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the main dining area. The sudden transition to the quiet hum of the restaurant was jarring. Several wealthy patrons were staring, having heard my mother shouting. I offered a polite nod to the maitre d' as I walked past his podium. I stepped out the front doors and into the cool Boston night air. I handed my ticket to the valet and stood waiting near the curb, taking a deep breath. The heavy, toxic atmosphere of my family was finally washing off my shoulders. The cool night air of Boston hit my face the second I stepped out of the restaurant. The valet rushed forward, recognizing me from my frequent business dinners, and hurried off to retrieve my car. I stood on the sidewalk adjusting my blazer and letting the tension of the dining room wash away. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder and more frantic. Grace, wait right there. I turned to see my older sister, Nicole, marching toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. Her face was twisted into a scowl of pure panic and indignation. Right behind her was her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant African-American structural engineer, a man whose quiet strength usually kept Nicole grounded. Tonight, however, his broad shoulders were tense, and his dark eyes burned with a frustration I had never seen directed at his wife before. Nicole reached out and grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into the fabric of my suit. You need to get back inside right now and hand Dad your credit card, she demanded, her voice shrill. Do you have any idea what you just did? Dad accidentally forgot his black card at home. They cannot pay for this. You cannot just leave us with a $4,000 bill. Remove your hand, Nicole. I am not paying for a dinner I did not want to attend, celebrating a trust fund that does not exist. You are just jealous of Madison, Nicole yelled, tightening her grip. You are trying to ruin her engagement because you are miserable. Just pay the stupid bill so we can go home. Before I could yank my arm away, Jamal stepped between us. He reached out and gently but firmly detached Nicole from my arm. He moved his tall frame to block her from reaching me again. That is enough, Nicole, Jamal said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. Do not touch her again. Jamal, whose side are you on? Nicole shrieked. She is leaving Mom and Dad to deal with this massive bill. They are going to call the police. Then they should not have ordered $500 bottles of wine when they cannot afford to pay for them, Jamal fired back. His voice was calm, but laced with a dangerous edge. I am sick and tired of watching your parents treat Grace like a human automated teller machine, while simultaneously treating her like absolute garbage. She owes them nothing. She owes you nothing. Nicole stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend his defiance. But they are family, Jamal. Grace is just acting out because she is jealous that Madison is marrying into a wealthy family while she sits alone in a cubicle. Jamal let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Jealous. Nicole, look at your sister. She is a highly respected forensic accountant who built a successful career from scratch. Your parents are broke social climbers who use her to fund their delusions of grandeur. I have sat at these family dinners for 5 years, biting my tongue while they disrespect her, and I am done doing it. Jamal took a step closer to his wife, lowering his voice to deliver a devastating ultimatum. You need to wake up and see how toxic your parents are. If you continue to enable their abuse, if you continue to participate in tearing your sister down, just to stay in your mother's good graces, I am leaving. You can choose this fake high society circus, or you can choose our marriage. But you cannot have both. Nicole went completely pale. The reality of his words hit her like a physical blow. She looked from Jamal to me, tears welling in her eyes, but she could not find a single word to say in her defense. Jamal turned his back on his wife and looked at me. His expression softened with genuine respect. You did the exact right thing in there, Grace. Do you want me to wait with you until your ride gets here? I can drive you home if you need a lift. I smiled at him, deeply appreciating the gesture. It was rare to find an ally in my family, but Jamal had always been the exception. Just then, the valet pulled my sleek black Porsche Panamera up to the curb. The engine purred perfectly. The valet stepped out and held the driver door open for me. I held up my keys, letting them jingle lightly in the night air. I am perfectly fine, Jamal, I said, walking slowly toward my car. Thank you for the offer, but I definitely do not need rescuing. You might want to get back inside, though. I have a feeling Richard is going to need your credit card to avoid washing dishes tonight. Jamal chuckled as I slid into the driver's seat. I drove away, leaving them standing on the sidewalk, fully aware that the chaos I left behind was only the beginning. The very next morning, the sun rose brightly over the affluent shopping districts of Boston. Madison was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging over her head. She strutted into an exclusive luxury boutique on Newbury Street, determined to purchase the perfect designer dress and matching accessories for her upcoming engagement party. She gathered armfuls of silk and lace, demanding attention from 3 sales associates. When she finally arrived at the checkout counter, the total was nearly $8,000. Madison smiled arrogantly and pulled a sleek black card from her purse. It was the card linked directly to the investment portfolio accounts my parents had supposedly transferred to her the day before. The machine beeped, flashing a red error message. The cashier frowned, looking uncomfortably at the screen. She tried inserting the chip. Another red flash. I am so sorry, Miss, the cashier said, her voice dropping to a polite, apologetic whisper. Your payment card has been completely declined. Madison stared at the cashier, her perfectly glossed lips parting in absolute disbelief. Declined, she repeated loudly, her voice rising to a pitch that made several nearby shoppers turn their heads. That is impossible. Try it again. The machine must be broken. This is a premium account linked to a $5 million portfolio. The cashier looked terrified. She slid the black card into the terminal again. The machine beeped, displaying the exact same bright red error code. I am truly sorry, Miss, the cashier whispered, pushing the card back across the counter. The bank is issuing a hard decline. It says the account has been flagged and frozen. I cannot process this transaction. Madison snatched the card back, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. She could feel the judging eyes of the other wealthy patrons burning into her back. She snatched her designer purse, abandoning the silk dresses on the counter, and stormed out of the boutique. Hitting the sidewalk of Newbury Street, she pulled out her phone and dialed her aunt. Across town in the Beacon Hill mansion, Patricia was sipping espresso. She was still fuming over my disrespect at the restaurant, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already collapsed. When her phone rang and she saw Madison calling, she answered with a tight, practiced smile. Good morning, darling, Patricia answered warmly. Did you find the perfect dress for your engagement party? Aunt Patricia, what is going on with my trust fund? Madison shrieked into the phone, ignoring the pleasantries. I am standing outside a boutique looking like an absolute fool. My card was declined. The cashier said the account was completely frozen. Fix this right now. My future mother-in-law is taking me to lunch and I refuse to look like a beggar whose credit cards bounce. Patricia sat up straight, nearly spilling her espresso. Declined. That has to be a mistake. Richard and I signed the transfer papers at the law office yesterday afternoon. The funds should be fully available in your name. Calm down, Madison. It is probably a security hold because you tried to spend $8,000 at once. I will call the private banker and have it sorted immediately. Wait for my call. Patricia hung up the phone. She was annoyed but not yet panicked, assuming this was a minor administrative glitch. She dialed her private wealth manager, Mr. Thorne, ready to unleash her demands. Mr. Thorne answered on the second ring. Good morning, Patricia. I was just about to call you. Well, you can save your pleasantries, Patricia snapped sharply. My niece is standing in a high-end shopping district with a declined card. We filed the living trust documents yesterday to transfer the portfolio to her name. Why are the funds frozen? Authorize her purchase this second. There was a heavy pause. Patricia, I cannot authorize anything, Mr. Thorne said in a serious tone. I received an alert from the central banking system an hour ago. All accounts associated with the Beacon Hill property and the investment portfolio have been placed under a total administrative lockdown. Patricia gripped her coffee cup tightly. A lockdown? What are you talking about? I am the client. Unfreeze it. I do not have the authority to do that, Mr. Thorne explained carefully. The lockdown was not initiated by our branch. It was triggered directly by the executive owner of the holding company. Patricia rolled her eyes. This is ridiculous. My husband and I are the owners. We just updated our estate planning. I bet this is a wire transfer issue caused by that incompetent financial firm where my daughter works. They manage the corporate accounts for the holding company. They must have messed up the paperwork. Patricia, you need to listen to me. Mr. Thorne tried to interject. The documents you filed yesterday conflict with the master operating agreement of your limited liability company. I strongly suggest you review your original paperwork. I do not need to review anything, Patricia yelled. I know exactly what is happening. Grace is retaliating because we had a fight at dinner last night. Her firm oversees the routing numbers. She probably filed a fraudulent security report just to delay the transfer to Madison. I will handle my vindictive daughter myself. Patricia slammed the phone down. She was blindingly furious. In her mind, I was just a bitter sibling throwing a tantrum. She grabbed her phone and dialed my personal number, ready to scream me into submission. I was sitting at my desk on the 40th floor, reviewing an audit when my phone began to buzz. The caller ID displayed my mother. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let the device ring 3 times, and then calmly answered. Hello, Mother. You listen to me right now, Patricia screamed through the speaker, her voice echoing in the quiet of my office. I know exactly what you are doing. Madison is crying on Newberry Street because her card declined. You deliberately messed up the bank routing at your firm to freeze her trust fund transfer. You are a jealous, petty little girl. You are going to fix the glitch at your stupid bank right now, or I swear I will have you fired for professional misconduct. I patiently let her finish her entire frantic, unhinged tirade. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, looking out the massive glass window at the Boston skyline. There is no glitch, Mother, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. And I did not mess up any routing numbers. I simply locked the accounts. You do not have the authority to lock my accounts. Patricia shrieked, her denial absolute. I took a slow, deep breath, delivering the precise words that would officially begin the absolute destruction of her fake empire. Did you ever read page 4 of the limited liability company agreement you signed 7 years ago, Mother? The line went completely dead. Patricia had hung up on me. Sitting in my office, I set my phone face down on the desk and allowed myself a genuine smile. I knew exactly what was happening at the Beacon Hill mansion right at this very moment. Total unfiltered panic. Back at the estate, Patricia threw her phone onto the plush velvet sofa. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as the weight of my words finally pierced through her impenetrable shield of arrogance. Page 4. What was on page 4? She spun around, her designer heels sinking into the expensive Persian rug, and marched straight toward my father's home office. Richard was sitting behind his massive oak desk, leisurely browsing a catalog of vintage watches. He looked up, annoyed by the sudden intrusion. Patricia did not even give him a chance to speak. She slammed her hands down on his desk, scattering his glossy magazines. "Get up right now," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "We need to find the corporate documents from 7 years ago, the ones we filed when we were dealing with the federal tax auditors. Where are they?" Richard frowned slowly, taking off his reading glasses. "What are you talking about? Those files are buried in the archives. We have not needed to look at them since we successfully transferred the assets and avoided bankruptcy. Why do you need them now?" "Because Madison just had her payment card declined on Newberry Street." Patricia yelled, her composure entirely shattered. "The private bank says the accounts are frozen by the executive owner. I just called Grace to demand she fix the bank routing, and she told me to read page 4 of the operating agreement. Get up and find that file right now." The mention of the frozen accounts and my name finally spurred Richard into action. The smug complacency vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden sharp anxiety. He stood up, grabbed a ring of keys from his drawer, and hurried to the large combination safe tucked into the corner of the office. His hands shook slightly as he spun the dial. He pulled open the heavy steel door and began frantically digging through stacks of old financial records. Patricia hovered over his shoulder, her breathing erratic. After several agonizing minutes of tossing files onto the floor, Richard finally pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. Stamped on the front was the seal of the state registry and the name of the limited liability company we had established 7 years prior. He carried the envelope back to his desk and pulled out the crisp, legally binding pages. He flipped quickly past the cover sheet, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. He flipped to page 2, then page 3. "Read it," Patricia snapped, pacing back and forth across the room. "What does it say? Tell me she is just bluffing. She has to be bluffing." Richard did not answer. He was staring at page 4. His eyes traced the lines of text over and over again, as if hoping the words would miraculously rearrange themselves. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick paper rattled in the quiet room. Patricia screamed, unable to handle the suspense any longer. "Tell me what it says." He slowly lowered this document to the desk. He looked up at his wife, and for the first time in his life, he looked completely terrified. "We do not own the company," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "We do not own the accounts. We do not own the investment portfolio. We do not even own this house." Patricia stopped pacing. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. "What are you talking about? We transferred everything into that company to protect it from the government. We put it in her name just to hold it. We are the beneficiaries." "No, we are not," Richard said, picking up the paper again, his eyes wide with horror. "Listen to this clause. It says, the designated executive member Grace retains 100% unencumbered ownership and absolute executive control over all corporate assets, properties, and liquid capital held within this entity. It explicitly states that any transfer, sale, or distribution of these assets without her direct notarized authorization is legally void and constitutes corporate fraud." Patricia leaned against the desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "But the living trust," she stammered. "We just paid the lawyer thousands of dollars yesterday to draft the living trust, transferring it all to Madison." "It is worthless," Richard yelled, finally losing his temper. "Do you not understand? We tried to give Madison assets that legally belong to Grace. You cannot draft a trust for money you do not own. The bank flagged it because Grace is the sole proprietor. She has completely locked us out." The reality of their situation crashed down on them like a collapsing building. They had spent years treating me like an unwanted burden, using my clean financial record to save themselves from federal prison, only to turn around and try to hand my rightful inheritance to my spoiled cousin. They thought they were the masterminds of high society. Now they were standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion that they did not even own, with bank accounts they could not touch. "We have to call her back," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "We have to make her unfreeze the accounts. Madison needs that money for her wedding. We will just tell Grace it was a misunderstanding. We will offer her a small percentage to play along." Before Richard could respond to this delusional plan, the sharp ringing of the house phone cut through the heavy silence of the office. The caller identification screen on the desk flashed with a prominent name. It was Beatrice Harrington. Patricia stared at the caller identification screen like it was a venomous snake. Beatrice Harrington was a ruthless matriarch who controlled Boston high society with an absolute iron fist. Her eldest son was Madison's wealthy fiancé. Patricia took a shuddering breath, smoothed her blonde hair, and picked up the receiver, forcing a bright musical tone into her voice. "Beatrice, darling, how wonderful to hear from you this morning. Save the fake pleasantries." Beatrice's sharp voice clipped through the phone line. "My event planners are finalizing the official wedding invitations. Before I approve the postage, my wealth management team needs the verification documents for Madison's $5 million dowry trust. They attempted to verify the routing numbers this morning, but the accounts are completely inaccessible." Patricia gripped the polished edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning white. She looked at Richard, sheer panic widening her eyes. "Oh," that Patricia laughed, a high, nervous sound. "It is just a temporary security hold, Beatrice. You know how overly cautious these private banks can be with large, sudden asset transfers. It is a minor administrative glitch. Everything will be fully cleared and accessible in a matter of days. See that it is, Beatrice replied coldly, completely unamused. My family does not merge assets with liabilities. I expect undeniable proof of funds by the end of the week, or there will be no wedding. The line clicked dead. Patricia slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She turned to Richard, her false high society confidence completely shattered. She will cancel the wedding. We will be public laughingstocks. You have to call Grace right now. You are her father. Make her listen. Across town, I sat in my glass-walled office, meticulously auditing a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud case. Spreadsheets filled my monitors, tracking embezzled funds hidden inside anonymous shell companies. The heavy irony was certainly not lost on me. I spent my days catching wealthy criminals trying to outsmart the system, while my parents had spent the last 7 years acting exactly like the targets of my federal investigations. My desk phone rang. It was not my personal cell, but the direct corporate line. I glanced down at the caller ID. It was Richard. I pressed the speakerphone button, not bothering to stop typing my report. Grace, sweetheart, Richard's voice floated smoothly into my quiet office. It was a jarring, immediate shift. Gone was the aggressive, commanding patriarch who had threatened me at the restaurant just last night. In his place was a smooth, manipulative negotiator desperately trying to close a bad deal. I am so glad I caught you at work. We need to talk, father to daughter. I am currently billing a corporate client at $400 an hour. Richard, I replied, my eyes scanning a column of fraudulent invoices. Make this fast. Grace, please listen to reason. He pleaded, his voice dripping with faux parental affection. We understand you are upset about the dinner. Your mother can be a bit harsh, and we apologize if you felt left out. But you cannot do this to your cousin. Madison's entire future is on the line. Beatrice Harrington is threatening to cancel the wedding. Just lift the bank freeze for a few days. Let the $5 million clear. You can keep the house. Just release the cash. I stopped typing. I swiveled my ergonomic chair around to face the sprawling, sunny view of the city. I treated him exactly like the hostile corporate subjects I interrogated for a living. You want me to release $5 million of my legal corporate assets to fund a fake dowry, I stated flatly. Let us review your history of financial generosity, shall we? When I was in college struggling to pay for expensive textbooks, you refused to co-sign a meager student loan because you claimed it would disrupt your debt-to-income ratio. You told me to get a third job. That was different, Richard stammered defensively. We were teaching you financial independence. When I needed first and last month rent for my starter apartment, you told me you were completely broke. I continued, my voice turning to absolute ice. Yet that exact same week you bought Madison a brand new luxury sports car for her birthday. You financially abandoned me at every single major milestone of my life. You used my pristine credit to save yourselves from federal prison, and then you had the audacity to try and gift my property to a girl who calls me a glorified calculator. We are your parents, he begged, the smooth facade cracking into genuine pathetic desperation. You are destroying our family over a silly grudge. I am not destroying anything, I replied. I am simply securing my corporate assets. If Beatrice Harrington cancels the wedding because Madison is broke, that sounds like a personal problem. Do not call this number again. I tapped the flashing button, disconnecting the call. I went right back to my complex spreadsheets, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, quiet peace. The rest of the week passed with blissful silence. I blocked their personal phone numbers, focusing entirely on my corporate audit and enjoying the calm rhythm of my independent life. But the true financial guillotine had not even dropped yet. My parents had spent 7 long years living in a historic Beacon Hill mansion, pretending they owned the walls around them. They had grown so accustomed to their luxurious lifestyle that they had completely forgotten the mechanics of how it was funded. The holding company I controlled automatically paid the massive property taxes and the hefty monthly mortgage directly from the investment yields. The first of the month arrived crisp and inevitable. At exactly midnight, the automated banking system attempted to pull the $30,000 mortgage payment for the Beacon Hill estate. The request hit the frozen accounts. The security system instantly rejected the transaction. A formal notice of non-payment was automatically generated and dispatched. The automated notice of non-payment hit my father's inbox at exactly 8 in the morning. I knew this because I had configured the holding company servers to send me blind copy alerts for every single piece of correspondence related to the estate. Sitting in my sleek high-rise apartment sipping a perfectly brewed espresso, I watched the digital delivery confirmation flash across my tablet. The financial guillotine had finally dropped. Over at the Beacon Hill mansion, the morning routine was entirely shattered. Richard typically spent his mornings reading financial papers, pretending to analyze market trends, while actually just admiring the expensive watches he could no longer afford. When that email arrived from the primary mortgage lender, his fake tranquility evaporated. The subject line was stark and uncompromising, demanding immediate action for a delinquent balance of $30,000. It was not just a polite reminder, it was a formal warning of impending default. I could picture the exact shade of panic washing over his face. He undoubtedly tried to log into the secondary accounts, the emergency funds, and the credit lines. All of them were locked tight. The wealth they had flaunted for 7 years was a mirage, and the desert had finally swallowed them whole. Patricia, meanwhile, was likely downstairs with Madison, reviewing imported silk fabric swatches for the lavish engagement party scheduled for next week. Madison had undoubtedly invited hundreds of Boston elites, promising them a night of unparalleled luxury to solidify her status before marrying into the hotel empire. The catering deposits alone would have cost a fortune they expected my accounts to cover. By noon, the reality of their situation must have fully crystallized. I imagined the frantic arguments echoing through the halls of the mansion. Richard pacing the floor, barking useless commands. Patricia clutching her phone, realizing her private banker was ignoring her calls. Madison throwing a massive tantrum, screaming that her entire life was being ruined by my jealousy. They had backed themselves into a corner entirely of their own making. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, my cell phone illuminated on my desk. I was at my office reviewing an intricate money laundering case for a tech client. I glanced at the glowing screen. A new text message had arrived from Patricia. She had bypassed the blocked calls by using a completely different phone number, likely a prepaid device Richard kept for emergencies. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It was a wall of frantic, unhinged text typed entirely in capital letters. The sheer desperation practically radiated through the glass screen. The mortgage is due, the bank is threatening default, unfreeze it now. Madison is having her engagement party next week. You are destroying your family over a petty misunderstanding. Fix this now. I read the words twice, savoring the absolute meltdown happening on the other end of the line. Patricia was not asking for a favor. She was still trying to issue commands, clinging to the delusion that she held some sort of maternal authority over me. She actually believed she could bully me into opening the vault and handing over my assets just so she could save face in front of her snobby friends. For years I had bent over backward to accommodate their demands. I had endured their insults, swallowed my pride, and allowed them to treat me like a disposable asset. I had saved them from federal prison, protected their lifestyle, and asked for nothing but basic respect in return. Instead, they had attempted to rob me blind and gift my property to a cousin who openly mocked my career. I set my coffee mug down on a coaster. I tapped the reply field on my phone screen. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not explain my feelings, justify my actions, or remind her of the immense legal trouble they were facing. I did not owe them an explanation. They already knew exactly what they had done. I typed 3 simple words, not my problem. I pressed send. I watched the little delivery checkmark appear. Then I immediately blocked that number too. I tossed the phone back onto my desk, turned my attention to the financial audit on my dual monitors, and went right back to work. I felt lighter than air. Back at the estate, the delivery of those 3 words hit Patricia like a physical blow. She stared at the screen of the prepaid phone, her manicured thumb hovering over the display. She read the message aloud to Richard and Madison, who were standing in the grand foyer. The reaction was explosive. Madison let out a shrill scream, stomping her foot against the hardwood floor. She demanded that Richard do something, threatening to move out and live in a hotel if the engagement party was canceled. Richard grabbed the phone from Patricia, his face purple with absolute fury. He tried to call the number back, only to hear the automated message confirming he had been blocked. Their initial panic rapidly curdled into blinding, irrational rage. Patricia refused to accept defeat. In her twisted mind, I was just a rebellious subordinate who needed to be publicly broken and brought back into line. She could not fathom a reality where the quiet, analytical daughter held the ultimate power over their lives. "We are not letting her do this," Patricia snarled, snatching her designer handbag from the console table. "She thinks she can hide behind her little accounting desk and ignore us. We will see how brave she is when we confront her in front of her colleagues." Richard nodded, a nasty, vindictive gleam in his eye. "Grab your coat," he ordered. "We are going downtown. We will march right into her fancy corporate lobby and demand our money back. We will shame her so thoroughly that she will have no choice but to surrender the accounts to save her professional reputation." They stormed out to ambush me here today. The lobby of my corporate financial firm was a monument to quiet power. Polished marble floors stretched across the expansive ground level, reflecting the natural light that poured through massive glass walls. It was a space designed to intimidate the unprepared and reassure the wealthy. The atmosphere was always hushed, filled only with the soft hum of central air conditioning and the rhythmic clicking of designer shoes. That perfect tranquility was violently shattered at exactly 3 in the afternoon. I was sitting at my desk on the 40th floor when my internal phone buzzed. It was Brenda, the head receptionist for our building. Her voice trembled slightly, which was highly unusual for a woman who routinely handled aggressive billionaire clients. "Grace," Brenda whispered urgently. "There is a situation in the main lobby. 3 people just forced their way past the exterior security checkpoint. A woman claiming to be your mother is screaming at the front desk. She is demanding that you come down immediately and is threatening to cause a massive scene if we do not comply." I closed my financial audit spreadsheet with a calm, measured keystroke. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. In fact, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I knew they would lack the basic self-control to handle my text message gracefully. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they actually thought they could intimidate me in my own professional environment. I told Brenda to remain calm, instructed her not to call the local police just yet, and promised I would be right down. I stood up, smoothed the pristine fabric of my tailored charcoal suit, and walked out of my office. I signaled for 2 of our internal corporate security guards, tall men in immaculate black suits, to follow me to the private executive elevator. The ride down was swift and silent. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the absolute chaos unfolding in the usually pristine lobby. Patricia was standing directly in front of the marble reception desk, her face contorted with unhinged rage. She was waving her expensive leather handbag around like a weapon. Richard stood right beside her, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red, trying to look imposing, but mostly just looking desperate. Madison lingered a few steps behind them, crossing her arms and scowling at a group of horrified executives who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "Where is my ungrateful, thieving daughter?" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the high glass ceilings. "You tell Grace to get down here right this second. She is a criminal. She is stealing from her own family, and I will not leave this building until she faces me." I stepped out of the elevator, flanked by the 2 large security guards. I did not look embarrassed. I did not look like a cowering child caught doing something wrong. I walked forward with the absolute authority of a chief executive officer dealing with an unruly trespasser. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, cutting through the noise of my mother screaming. Patricia stopped mid-sentence when she saw me approaching. Her eyes widened, taking in the security guards and my cold, unbothered expression. She expected me to rush over, begging her to lower her voice to save my professional reputation. She expected me to surrender immediately out of pure humiliation. She was entirely wrong. "Hello, Mother," I said, stopping a generous 10 feet away from them. "I see you brought the whole circus with you today. What exactly do you think you are accomplishing by throwing a temper tantrum in a corporate lobby?" Richard stepped forward, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest. "Do not you dare speak to your mother with that tone, Grace. We are here to put an end to this ridiculous game you are playing. You are going to pull out your phone, contact the bank, and unfreeze our money right now." I tilted my head slightly, observing his complete desperation. "Or what, Richard?" Or what exactly will you do? Madison stomped her foot on the marble floor, her face twisting into an ugly, petulant scowl. You have to fix this, Grace. My engagement party is next week. The caterers are threatening to cancel the entire event because the initial deposit bounced. You are ruining the most important week of my entire life just because you are a jealous, bitter accountant who cannot get a husband. My future mother-in-law is already asking questions and demanding proof of funds. I looked at my cousin with complete and total indifference. I told you before, Madison. Your fake wealth and your failing engagement are not my problem. If you cannot afford to feed your guests, I highly suggest you cancel the party and learn to live within your actual means. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. You little thief, Patricia yelled, taking a step toward me. One of the security guards immediately shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of me to block her path. Patricia stopped glaring at the guard before turning her furious gaze back to me. How can you stand there and act like you own those accounts? We raised you. We gave you everything. You are nothing but a glorified employee who is currently holding our rightful property hostage. I did not flinch at all. You gave me nothing but criticism and conditional approval, I replied smoothly. And legally speaking, I am the sole owner of the holding company. You handed me those assets 7 years ago to hide them from the federal government. You made your bed, and now you have to sleep in it without a blanket. Richard practically vibrated with rage. He pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket, holding it up like a weapon. That is it. I am calling the police right now. Call them, Richard. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet marble lobby. Dial 911 right now and tell them your daughter is stealing from you. But before you hit send, look at the documents I brought down with me. I reached into my structured leather briefcase and slowly pulled out a thick, certified legal folder. The bright red seal of the federal government was stamped vividly on the front cover. I held it up. The passing executives in the lobby had stopped pretending to ignore the commotion. My parents, who thrived on maintaining a flawless public image, were now the main attraction of a humiliating spectacle. Richard hesitated, his thumb hovering over his phone. Patricia narrowed her eyes. I opened the folder and began reading aloud with the precise cadence of a prosecuting attorney. Internal Revenue Code Section 7201. I recited, keeping my eyes locked onto my father. Any person who willfully attempts to evade or defeat any tax imposed by this title shall be guilty of a felony. Shall I continue to the penalties section? I asked smoothly. Upon conviction, the individual shall be fined not more than $100,000 or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both together with the costs of prosecution. The words hung heavy in the air. They had spent years treating me like an obedient child who would simply absorb their financial burdens without asking questions. They severely underestimated my professional expertise. Patricia let out a shaky breath. You are bluffing, she whispered, though her voice lacked any real conviction. You would never hand your own parents over to the federal government. I closed the folder with a definitive snap. I will not have to hand you over, Mother. You will do it yourselves. If you call the police or attempt a civil lawsuit to reclaim those assets, the court will require a full financial discovery process. They will trace the deed of the Beacon Hill mansion and the $5 million investment portfolio right back to the very day you transferred them. When the court auditors trace that transfer, they will immediately see that you dumped your entire net worth into a corporate shell strictly to hide it from the Internal Revenue Service. You committed textbook federal fraud to avoid asset seizure. I simply provided the clean name you needed to execute your desperate little scheme. Legally speaking, I did nothing wrong. I am the sole legitimate owner of those accounts and that property. But you two committed a massive federal crime. You sat in that lawyer office yesterday, attempting to gift away a fortune that was only shielded by my pristine reputation. You treated me like a disposable employee, assuming I would just quietly absorb your disrespect. Richard slowly lowered his phone. The aggressive red color in his cheeks drained away, leaving him looking sickly and entirely defeated. He finally understood the corner he backed himself into. If you take me to court now, Richard, I continued, you will not win back the mansion. You will not win back the $5 million. The only thing you will win is a direct one-way ticket to federal prison for tax fraud. You have absolutely no leverage here. You handed me the keys to your financial kingdom 7 years ago, and I am officially changing the locks. The two corporate security guards flanked my sides, their presence a silent, imposing reminder that I was the one in absolute control of this building. My parents looked small, their false upper-class bravado completely stripped away by the harsh reality of federal law. The gravity of the situation hit Madison like a freight train. She had been standing behind my parents waiting for them to magically bully me into submission so she could go back to planning her extravagant wedding. When she realized that my parents were powerless and that her massive inheritance was permanently gone, she completely lost her mind. Madison lunged forward, pushing past Patricia. She stomped her designer heels against the polished marble floor, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "You cannot do this to me!" Madison shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly around the vast lobby. "You are ruining my entire life. My engagement party is next week. The deposit for the caterer is due tomorrow morning. What am I supposed to tell my future mother-in-law? You are just a bitter, jealous accountant, trying to destroy my happiness because nobody wants to marry you." Her screeching voice cracked as she flailed her arms, desperately trying to salvage her shattered aristocratic fantasies. The wealthy persona she had so carefully curated for social media was evaporating, leaving behind nothing but an entitled, greedy woman-child who was finally being denied her allowance. Tears began streaming down her face, ruining her meticulously applied makeup. She was hyperventilating, completely incapable of handling the word no. I did not raise my voice or react to her childish insults. I calmly stepped forward, bypassing my frozen parents entirely, and closed the distance between myself and my cousin. I leaned in very close, invading her personal space, so that only she could hear my next words. "Madison," I whispered, my voice dripping with icy amusement. "You are currently having a temper tantrum over a fake trust fund, but you should really be worrying about your precious billionaire fiancé. I received a formal, highly confidential email this morning from his family wealth management team. They requested a full verification of your assets before they mail out the official wedding invitations." I paused, letting the terror bloom in her eyes. "I know the devastating truth about your actual net worth, Madison, and in exactly 30 seconds your future in-laws are going to know it too. Your entire facade of high society glamour is about to be completely dismantled, and there is absolutely nothing your aunt or uncle can do to stop it from happening." Madison stopped breathing. The manic energy that had fueled her screaming fit completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing dread. She took a stumbling step backward, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the polished marble floor. Her eyes darted wildly from my face to the two towering security guards, and finally to her aunt and uncle, looking for someone, anyone, to tell her this was just a cruel joke. But Patricia and Richard were equally frozen. They knew exactly how ruthless the billionaire hotel empire family could be. That family did not acquire their generational wealth by letting social climbing opportunists marry into their dynasty without conducting a forensic background check. They employed teams of vicious corporate lawyers and private investigators specifically to hunt down gold diggers. "You are lying," Madison stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked, breathy whisper. "You do not know anything about my finances. I have perfect credit. I belong in their world." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Perfect credit," I repeated, shaking my head at her sheer delusion. "Madison, you have spent the last 5 years living entirely off the allowance my parents skimmed from their hidden assets. But you could not even manage that properly. I did not just freeze the holding company accounts today. I ran a comprehensive audit on every single liability connected to your name. Do you want me to read the itemized list right here in the middle of the lobby?" Madison shook her head frantically, but I did not stop. "You have maxed out 4 separate premium credit cards," I stated, my voice carrying clear and crisp across the quiet lobby. "You owe $22,000 to a luxury travel agency for that trip to St. Bart's you took last summer. You are 3 months behind on the lease payments for your imported sports car. Your actual, verifiable net worth is negative $80,000. You are drowning in consumer debt, and your billionaire fiancé has absolutely no idea that you are a complete financial liability. Patricia gasped loudly, clutching her chest. She whipped her head around to glare at her niece. Madison, is this true? Patricia hissed, her pristine public image shattering under the weight of the scandal. Have you been hiding debt from us? Madison burst into fresh, humiliated tears, covering her face with her hands. She could not even form a coherent sentence to defend herself. The glossy high society facade she had meticulously built on social media had just been nuked in front of a dozen corporate executives who were watching the entire scene unfold. I smoothly reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I tapped the screen, opening my corporate email client. I held the device up so Madison, Patricia, and Richard could all clearly see the drafted message waiting in my outbox. This is a direct email to the lead wealth manager of your future in-laws, I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional and devoid of any sympathy. Attached is a heavily encrypted, mathematically undeniable report, detailing your $80,000 of high-interest debt, along with undeniable proof that the $5 million dowry trust you promised them is legally void. They asked for verification, and as a certified financial professional, I am legally obligated to provide them with the accurate data. Richard lunged forward, his heavy dress shoes slipping slightly on the marble. Give me that phone right now, Grace, he bellowed, reaching out with a meaty hand to snatch the device from my grasp. Before he could even cross the distance, the security guard on my right moved with blinding speed. He stepped directly into his path, placing a firm, unyielding hand flat against my father and shoved him backward with enough force to send Richard stumbling into a decorative marble pillar. Touch her again, the security guard warned in a low, dangerous rumble, and you will be leaving this building in handcuffs. Richard caught his balance, panting heavily, his face a terrifying shade of purple. He looked at the guard, then at me, finally realizing that his patriarchal authority meant absolutely nothing in my corporate domain. I was completely untouchable. I looked down at the digital clock on my phone screen. I am setting a timer, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the lobby. You have exactly 30 seconds to turn around, walk out those glass doors, and leave my building. If I can still see your faces when that timer hits 0, I will press send on this email, and the Hotel Empire family will cancel the wedding before you even reach your car. 29, I started counting aloud. Patricia panicked. The threat of total social destruction was the only thing that could override her stubborn pride. She grabbed Madison by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the expensive silk blouse. We are leaving, Patricia barked, her voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. Richard grabbed her purse. Move. 25. I counted, watching them scramble. Richard scooped up that discarded designer bag from the floor. The three of them looked like a pack of frightened animals fleeing a predator. They practically shoved each other out of the way to get to the revolving glass doors. They burst out onto the busy Boston sidewalk, the heavy doors spinning wildly in their wake. They did not look back. I lowered my phone, letting out a slow, steady exhale. The lobby slowly returned to its normal hushed state. The executives who had stopped to watch the drama unfold quickly averted their eyes and hurried toward the elevators. I thanked the guards, but I knew Patricia. She refused to lose face. Outside, she dragged Madison toward their illegally parked luxury vehicle. Stop crying, Patricia ordered. We will force this marriage. We will host the lavish engagement party at the Beacon Hill mansion. Anyway, she decided, completely blinded by her ego and her massive, overwhelming greed for absolute power. The evening rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown apartment. I sat on my velvet sofa, swirling a glass of Cabernet, savoring the absolute silence. The silence did not last. The heavy oak door of my apartment echoed with a frantic, desperate knocking. I checked the security monitor on the wall. It was my older sister, Nicole. Her usually perfect hair was plastered to her cheeks by the rain, and mascara ran down her face in dark streaks. I pressed the intercom button and buzzed her up. A minute later, I opened my front door. Nicole practically fell into my entryway, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked nothing like the arrogant woman who had sneered at me in the restaurant parking lot. She looked completely broken. "Grace, please," Nicole cried, clutching the wet fabric of her trench coat. "You have to stop this. You have to give them the house." I calmly closed the door and watched her unravel. "I am not giving them anything, Nicole," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "They committed federal fraud to hide it, and now they are facing the consequences of their own staggering greed." "But you are destroying our family!" Nicole shrieked, her voice echoing in my quiet foyer. "Madison is having a nervous breakdown. Her fiancé is demanding financial proof. Mom and Dad are terrified of going to prison. They have nothing left, Grace. You cannot just leave them with nothing." "I can and I will." Where was this desperate concern for family unity when they were treating me like a disposable asset? Where were your tears when they forced me to pay their exorbitant restaurant bills? You stood by and enabled their abuse for decades because it kept you in their good graces. You sold me out for a pat on the head from two people who would throw you under the bus just as fast. Nicole squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "I was just trying to keep the peace. You know how they get. It is easier to just go along with it. Please, Grace, just release the deed to the Beacon Hill mansion. Let them save face. I am begging you." Before I could deliver another dose of harsh reality, the elevator chime rang down the hall. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached my open door. Jamal appeared in the doorway. My brother-in-law was soaked from the rain, carrying a large canvas duffel bag slung over his broad shoulder. He glared at his wife. "I knew I would find you here," Jamal said. His deep voice resonated through the hallway, devoid of any warmth. "Jamal," Nicole gasped, stepping toward him. "What are you doing here? Why do you have a bag?" "I came to see if you would actually do it," Jamal answered, stepping into the entryway. "I wanted to see if you would really come here and beg your sister to hand over her legal property to save those toxic parasites you call parents. I hoped you would prove me wrong, Nicole. I hoped you had at least an ounce of moral backbone. But here you are doing their dirty work." Jamal dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a loud thud. Nicole stared at the bag, a fresh wave of panic replacing her tears. "What is that?" she stammered. "It is my luggage," Jamal stated flatly. "I am leaving, Nicole." "No," Nicole screamed, lunging forward to grab his arm. "Jamal, you cannot leave me. We are trying to start a family. We are trying to have a baby." Jamal did not pull away, but he looked down at her with absolute disgust. "That is exactly why I am leaving. I refuse to raise a child in a family that normalizes this level of toxic manipulation. I refuse to let my future son or daughter watch your parents financially and emotionally abuse people. And most importantly, I refuse to be married to a woman who lacks the spine to stand up to them." He looked at me, giving me a firm nod of respect, then turned his gaze back to his weeping wife. "Grace is the only person in your entire bloodline who possesses any actual integrity. Your parents stole from her, insulted her, and tried to rob her blind. And your response is to run over here and beg the victim to surrender to her abusers. It is pathetic, Nicole." "Jamal, please, I will change," Nicole sobbed, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor. "I will cut them off, I promise. Just do not walk out that door." Jamal looked down at her, his expression hardening into stone. "Then prove it right now. You have a choice to make, Nicole. You can walk out that door with me, block their phone numbers, and never look back. Or you can stay here, keep fighting their losing battles, and I will have divorce papers sent to your office by Monday morning. Choose." Nicole froze. The ultimatum hung heavily in the damp air of the entryway. She looked at Jamal, the man who had loved and supported her for years. Then she looked at her phone, which was currently lighting up with frantic, demanding text messages from Patricia. She was entirely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the decision. Her lifelong conditioning to obey our toxic mother was violently clashing with the reality of losing her husband. As Nicole knelt on the floor, suffocating under the pressure of her own spinelessness, my cell phone chimed loudly from the kitchen counter. It was a specialized alert tone I had set for highly urgent financial notifications. I walked into the kitchen, leaving the crumbling couple behind. I picked up my phone. A formal email had just arrived from the primary lending institution. The bank had just issued the official notice of default on the Beacon Hill estate. The grace period was completely over. I looked at Jamal, then down at my sister. The clock stopped. The clock stopped. Exactly 1 week later, the crisp evening air of Boston carried the scent of imported white roses across the historic cobblestone streets. The Beacon Hill mansion glowed like a beacon of absolute extravagance against the darkening sky. Despite the severe legal warnings and the undeniable reality of their total financial ruin, my mother Patricia had adamantly refused to cancel the engagement party. In her delusional mind, canceling the event meant admitting defeat. Hosting it meant she could somehow force the marriage to happen before the bank foreclosed on the property. Dozens of hired valets in crisp red vests sprinted up and down the private driveway, parking an endless parade of luxury vehicles. Glistening sports cars and heavy luxury sport utility vehicles lined the street. Inside the massive estate, Patricia had orchestrated a masterclass in financial deception. She hired a string quartet to play classical music in the grand foyer. Waiters carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and expensive champagne woven seamlessly through the crowd of Boston elite. Patricia glided across the polished hardwood floors, acting as if she were the undisputed queen of the city. She wore a custom designer gown that she definitely charged to a high-interest credit card she could never repay. I knew she was putting on the performance of a lifetime, because she had to convince Beatrice Harrington that her family was financially flawless. She reveled in the compliments from the other socialites, soaking up their admiration like a sponge. Every time someone complimented the intricate floral displays or the vintage champagne, she would smile graciously and pretend she was the rightful master of this vast domain. She was desperately clinging to a fantasy world that was rapidly disintegrating. I could picture her exact movements. She would seek out Beatrice near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room. Patricia would offer a charming, sophisticated laugh and spin a web of elaborate lies. She would confidently explain that the temporary hold on Madison's $5 million dowry trust was simply a byproduct of an aggressive corporate restructuring. She would assure the wealthy matriarch that the minor glitch had been entirely resolved and that the funds would be available in a matter of days. Patricia was betting her entire future on the slim hope that the groom would say his vows before anyone bothered to check the bank accounts again. She was dancing wildly on the deck of a sinking ship, completely ignoring the icy water rushing in below her feet. Across the room, Madison was fully immersed in her own toxic vanity. She completely ignored the impending doom hovering over her head. Instead of worrying about her massive debt or the fraudulent foundation of her impending marriage, she spent the entire evening staging perfectly curated photos for her social media accounts. She dragged her wealthy fiancé from room to room, forcing him to pose next to the towering floral arrangements. She flashed her gaudy diamond ring at the camera, applying a digital filter to make the entire event look absolutely magical. Her future mother-in-law. Beatrice watched her from across the room, with a cold, calculating gaze, clearly unconvinced by the frantic display of happiness. But Madison remained blissfully blind to the scrutiny. She grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing waiter and threw her head back in a staged laugh, ensuring the hired photographer captured her best angle. Madison laughed loudly, making sure everyone in the room noticed her joy. She desperately needed her thousands of online followers to validate her existence. She needed them to believe she was a wealthy, sophisticated bride marrying into a billionaire dynasty. She had convinced herself that if she just smiled hard enough and posted enough beautiful pictures, the terrible truth about her negative $80,000 net worth would simply vanish into thin air. The sheer audacity of their behavior was staggering. My parents and my cousin were hosting a six-figure celebration in a mansion they did not legally own, using money they did not legally possess. They were standing on property that formally belonged to my holding company, and they were blatantly ignoring the official notice of default that the primary lending institution had issued earlier that week. They thought they could simply outrun federal law and corporate reality with sheer stubbornness and a few expensive bottles of champagne. They believed their aristocratic facade was completely impenetrable. They assumed I would sit quietly in my downtown apartment, too intimidated by their high society guests to cause a scene. They expected me to remain the obedient, silent daughter who always absorbed their disrespect without fighting back. They were entirely wrong. While the string quartet played a lively symphony, and Patricia clinked her crystal glass against the glasses of unsuspecting billionaires. A sleek black sport utility vehicle slowly turned onto the cobblestone street. The heavy vehicle rolled past the line of parked luxury cars and came to a smooth stop directly in front of the towering wrought iron gates of the Beacon Hill estate. The dark-tinted windows shielded the occupants from the curious glances of the busy valet staff. The heavy doors of the black sport utility vehicle closed with a solid, echoing thud against the crisp Boston night. I stood on the damp cobblestone driveway of the Beacon Hill estate, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored navy blue suit. The fabric felt like armor. Beside me, Jamal adjusted his own dark tie. His presence was a steady, calming anchor. He had walked away from my sister, choosing integrity over the toxic comfort of this family. He stood tall, radiating quiet strength. Finally, the third passenger stepped out of the vehicle. He was Mr. Stone, the chief asset recovery agent representing the primary lending institution. He wore a gray suit and held a thick leather clipboard pressed firmly against his chest. That clipboard contained the official documents we needed. The notice of foreclosure and eviction was finalized and ready for immediate delivery. We did not exchange any words. We simply turned and began walking up the sweeping brick pathway toward the massive oak front doors. A dozen frantic valets were sprinting back and forth, grabbing keys from wealthy guests arriving in luxury sedans. One young valet stepped forward, raising a hand to ask for our formal invitations. Jamal did not say a word. He simply leveled a single uncompromising look at the young man. The valet immediately lowered his hand and stepped aside, allowing us to pass without question. We walked right past the valet stand and approached the grand entrance. The heavy double doors stood wide open, welcoming the financial elite of the city into a fraudulent fantasy world. I stepped over the threshold, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble of the grand foyer. The interior of the mansion was practically dripping with unearned excess. Thousands of imported white roses tumbled over the curved banisters of the grand staircase, filling the air with an overwhelmingly sweet perfume. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated seamlessly through the crowded room, carrying silver trays stacked high with expensive caviar and vintage champagne. It was a masterpiece of financial deception funded entirely by stolen time and unpaid debts. At the far end of the sprawling room, a professional string quartet played a lively, sophisticated symphony. The guests laughed and clinked their crystal glasses, completely oblivious to the reality that the ground beneath their designer shoes was legally owned by the woman standing in the doorway. We moved deliberately into the center of the grand foyer. I did not try to blend in with the glittering sea of expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. My sharp corporate attire cut a stark contrast against the party atmosphere, signaling immediately that I was not a guest arriving late. I was an executive arriving to handle business. The lead violinist of the string quartet noticed us first. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of two serious professionals and a bank representative holding a clipboard. His bow faltered against the strings, producing a sharp, discordant screech that echoed horribly through the cavernous room. The other musicians stumbled, their rhythm completely broken by the sudden mistake. Within 5 seconds, the lively symphony ground to a halting, awkward stop. The sudden silence was absolutely deafening. Conversations abruptly died as hundreds of wealthy guests turned their heads toward the entrance. They stared at the three of us standing shoulder to shoulder in the brightly lit entryway. Across the room, near a towering swan ice sculpture, my mother Patricia froze. She had been in the middle of laughing at a joke made by Beatrice Harrington, the ruthless matriarch of the Groom family. Patricia locked eyes with me, and I watched the blood drain entirely from her face. Absolute panic contorted her perfectly manicured features. The smug, aristocratic facade she had been projecting all evening instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. She abandoned her crystal champagne flute on a passing waiter tray, not even looking to see if it balanced properly. She practically sprinted across the polished hardwood floor, her expensive silk gown swishing violently around her ankles. She shoved her way through a group of bewildered corporate investors, desperate to intercept me before Beatrice noticed the intrusion. Patricia closed the distance rapidly, her breathing erratic and shallow. She stopped mere inches from my face, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She deliberately angled her body, desperately trying to block me from the view of the groom family standing across the room. "How dare you show your face here?" Patricia hissed. Her voice was a venomous, frantic whisper meant only for my ears. "Get out before I have you thrown out. You are ruining the most important night of our lives. You have absolutely no right to be in this house. Get out right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at her with pure, absolute indifference. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my presence. I simply looked at her the way one might look at a smudge of dirt on a clean window. Her threats were empty, meaningless echoes from a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Jamal shifted his stance slightly, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. He glared down at Patricia, silently daring her to make a physical move. The bank representative stood calmly behind us, his pen poised over the clipboard, waiting for my signal to proceed. Patricia realized her harsh whispers were not working. Her eyes darted around the quiet room, seeing the confused faces of the Boston elite staring at her defensive posture. She was completely trapped in her own web of lies. I stepped sideways, easily bypassing Patricia entirely, without saying a single word to her. I walked straight past her frozen, visibly trembling form and headed directly toward the small wooden podium, holding the microphone set up for the evening toasts. I reached the podium, firmly grasped the cold metal microphone, and tapped it twice to get everyone's undivided attention. The two sharp taps against the metal grill of the microphone echoed like gunshots through the cavernous grand foyer of the Beacon Hill estate. The high-pitched sound sliced through the lingering murmurs of the wealthy guests and the frantic rustling of Patricia's silk gown. The sudden silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Hundreds of Boston elites turned their undivided attention toward the small wooden podium. They expected to see Richard standing there with a crystal glass of expensive champagne, ready to deliver a heartwarming toast about his beloved niece. Instead, they saw me. I stood tall and unwavering in my sharp navy blue suit, flanked by the imposing presence of Jamal and the silent authority of the bank representative. I adjusted the microphone stand with slow, deliberate precision. I looked out over the sea of designer dresses and custom tuxedos. My gaze swept past the bewildered faces of corporate investors and socialites until it locked directly onto Beatrice Harrington. The formidable matriarch of the hotel empire stood near the ice sculpture. Her eyes narrowed in sharp, calculating suspicion. She knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. I leaned into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice projecting clearly through the massive speakers strategically placed around the room. I did not sound nervous or emotional. I sounded exactly like a forensic accountant delivering a finalized audit report to a board of directors. "I want to welcome you all to this beautiful historic property. My name is Grace, and I am the sole executive owner of the holding company that legally possesses the deed to the very floor you are currently standing on." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of affluent guests. Whispers broke out immediately, spreading like wildfire among the tight-knit social circles. Across the room, Patricia looked as though the floor had simply vanished beneath her designer heels. She swayed slightly, reaching out to grip the edge of a nearby catering table just to keep herself upright. Richard was frozen near the sweeping staircase, his face a mixture of blinding rage and total terrifying paralysis. They had spent 7 years convincing this exact room of people that they were aristocratic masters of generational wealth. With one single sentence, I had set a match to their entire fraudulent kingdom. "I know many of you are here tonight to celebrate the upcoming marriage of my cousin Madison to the Harrington family." I continued, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "I am sure you have been treated to wonderful stories about massive trust funds and secure financial futures. Unfortunately, as a licensed financial professional, I have a strict legal and ethical obligation to correct material misrepresentations regarding corporate assets." I locked eyes with Beatrice Harrington again, ensuring she heard every single word clearly. "There is no $5 million dowry trust fund. There is no hidden family fortune waiting to be unlocked. The financial documents my parents proudly flaunted to the Harrington Wealth Management team yesterday were completely fabricated. They attempted to illegally gift assets that belong entirely to my corporation. The money they promised you does not exist, and it never did. The murmurs in the grand foyer escalated into a chaotic symphony of shocked voices. Wealthy investors began exchanging horrified glances, realizing they had been associating with absolute frauds. Beatrice Harrington stiffened her spine, her face turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She turned her piercing glare directly toward Patricia, who was now openly weeping near the ice sculpture. "But the illusion does not stop there," I announced, raising my voice slightly to cut through the escalating noise of the crowd. "The lavish event you are attending tonight is being hosted on completely stolen time. My parents, Richard and Patricia, do not own this mansion. They transferred it to me 7 years ago to hide it from aggressive federal tax auditors. And because they have spent the last decade living wildly beyond their actual means, they have completely drained their secondary resources." I gestured toward the sweeping staircase and the thousands of imported white roses decorating the banisters. "This entire engagement party is being funded by massive credit they cannot ever repay. The plain truth is they are entirely broke. In fact, they are currently 90 days past due on the massive mortgage for this exact property. The bank has officially rejected their payments because the accounts they relied upon are now permanently frozen." The collective shock of the Boston elite hit an absolute fever pitch. Socialites literally took steps backward, distancing themselves physically from Patricia and Richard as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. Being broke was the ultimate sin in their superficial world, but being exposed as a desperate fraud was an unforgivable crime. Suddenly, a piercing, unhinged scream shattered the remaining composure of the room. Madison shoved her way violently through a group of terrified guests. Her face was flushed dark red, and her elaborate engagement dress was tangled around her ankles. She sprinted toward the podium. "You are a liar!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "You are just a bitter spinster trying to ruin my life." She lunged forward, attempting to snatch the heavy metal microphone out of my hands. Jamal stepped forward instantly. He did not hurt her, but he firmly planted his large frame directly in front of the podium, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between my cousin and me. Madison crashed into his solid shoulder, sobbing hysterically and flailing her arms. She looked like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of a high society gala. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at her pathetic display and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The truth was finally out in the open. I turned my head slightly to the left and looked at Mr. Stone. I gave the bank representative a single sharp nod, signaling him to step forward and deliver the fatal blow. Mr. Stone moved with quiet efficiency. He stood completely perfectly still, like a highly trained soldier, executing a very important and dangerous mission without displaying any hesitation at all. He bypassed Madison and Jamal, stepping directly between the podium and my mother. Patricia clutched the catering table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Mr. Stone as if he were the Grim Reaper himself. He raised his leather clipboard, unclipped a thick stack of official legal documents stamped with heavy red ink, and extended his hand toward her. Patricia refused to take the papers right now. She shrank back, shaking her head side to side in a frantic, jerky motion. She clung to the delusion that refusing to touch the eviction notice would somehow make her bankruptcy disappear. When she refused to accept the envelope, he simply dropped the heavy stack of papers squarely onto the silver catering tray right next to her abandoned champagne glass. The paper slapped against the tray, echoing through the room. I leaned back into the microphone, making sure my voice carried over the quiet sobs of my cousin and the shocked whispers of the Boston elite. "You have all witnessed a masterclass in deception tonight," I announced, my tone completely unwavering. My parents built their entire social standing on a mountain of unpaid bills and federal tax evasion. They used my pristine financial record to hide their remaining assets in a corporate holding company 7 years ago. They thought they could simply command me to hand over the keys to my kingdom so they could fund this extravagant fake lifestyle. But since my parents decided to sit in a law office yesterday, attempting to leave me absolutely nothing, and illegally give my cousin everything. I made a different choice. I decided to take exactly what is legally mine. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the minds of the wealthy investors and socialites surrounding us. I have officially sold this historic property back to the primary lending institution to clear the massive delinquent debt that Patricia and Richard recklessly incurred. This estate is no longer a private residence funded by my hard work. There will be no lavish dowry to secure a marriage built on absolute lies. The gasps from the crowd grew louder, but I was not finished. I looked directly at Patricia, whose face was now a mask of absolute horror. I then shifted my gaze to Richard, who was still standing paralyzed near the grand staircase. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate these premises. I stated the finality of my words ringing through the grand foyer. In exactly 120 minutes, the private security team standing outside those doors will enter this building. They will change every single lock, activate the perimeter alarms, and physically remove anyone who remains inside. You may pack your personal clothing and basic necessities, but every piece of high-value art, every piece of imported furniture, and every single crystal glass in this room legally belongs to the holding company to cover your outstanding liabilities. Madison stopped thrashing against Jamal. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her eyes wide with total comprehension. The lavish engagement party she had meticulously planned, the thousands of white roses, the imported caviar, all of it was crashing down around her. She was not a wealthy heiress. She was a broke, unemployed fraud standing in a foreclosed house. She looked down at her hands, then up at her wealthy fiancé, who had quietly backed away from her during my speech. He looked absolutely disgusted. The atmosphere in this room violently shifted from stunned silence to active panic. The wealthy guests did not want to be associated with a public eviction or a federal fraud scandal. Socialites began reaching for their designer coats. Corporate investors started murmuring urgently to their spouses, discreetly moving toward the heavy oak front doors. They were fleeing the sinking ship as fast as their tailored shoes could carry them. The illusion of Boston royalty dissolved into a chaotic scramble for the nearest exit. Nobody wanted to be caught standing in a repossessed mansion when the authorities arrived to secure the perimeter. The string quartet quietly packed away their expensive instruments, sensing the absolute finality of the evening. The waitstaff stopped serving champagne and began gathering the silver trays, retreating toward the catering kitchen to secure their own equipment. I watched the mass exodus with profound satisfaction. I had dismantled a toxic, abusive empire without ever raising my voice or losing my composure. I had used their own greed to build the very trap that ultimately destroyed them. Jamal stood proudly beside me, his presence a constant reminder that true family is built on respect, not manipulation. He had watched my parents abuse my generosity for years, and now he was witnessing the ultimate justified consequence of their actions. I knew the emotional toll this family had exacted on me, and he knew that tonight was the necessary closure I had long deserved. He gave me a small approving nod. As the crowd thinned, leaving only a scattering of horrified onlookers, a sharp, authoritative movement caught my eye. The crowd parted instantly, recognizing the sheer power radiating from the woman stepping forward. It was Beatrice Harrington. The formidable matriarch of the hotel empire did not flee with the rest of the frightened socialites. She strode directly into the center of the grand foyer, her posture rigidly perfect, her expensive silk gown trailing behind her like a royal cape. The air crackled with intense electricity as she prepared to unleash her wrath. Her face was flushed with a terrifying absolute fury. She did not look at me. She did not look at the fleeing guests. Beatrice Harrington stopped directly in front of the catering table, her piercing, furious gaze locking dead onto Patricia and the sobbing Madison. Beatrice Harrington did not yell. She did not need to raise her voice to command absolute authority. She stood before the catering table, radiating a terrifying composure that made the surrounding guests hold their breath. Patricia was backed against the silver trays, trembling visibly under the crushing weight of the matriarch's glare. Madison was beside her, sobbing, covering her face to hide from the catastrophic reality unfolding around them. Patricia Beatrice began, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the grand foyer like a sharpened blade. You assured me yesterday that the discrepancy with your daughter dowry was a simple administrative error. You sat in my country club sipping my tea and looked me directly in the eye while you lied to my face. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but only a desperate wheeze escaped her throat. She raised a shaking hand, reaching out to Beatrice. Beatrice, please. Patricia stammered, her high society accent falling apart. It is a misunderstanding. Grace is just a disgruntled, vindictive child. We can fix this. We can explain everything. You will explain nothing, Beatrice snapped, stepping closer, forcing Patricia to press her back against the table. Do you honestly think my family amassed our fortune by being naive? My wealth management team warned me about your erratic credit history 3 days ago. They told me your corporate filings looked like a desperate shell game. I gave you the benefit of the doubt because of your supposed pedigree. I see now that your pedigree is nothing but cheap paint. You are common con artists. The words struck Patricia like a physical blow. She crumpled inward, burying her face in her hands, letting out a humiliated wail. The remaining guests murmured in absolute shock, their worst suspicions confirmed by the most powerful woman in the room. Beatrice turned her unforgiving gaze toward Madison. Madison shrank back, terrified. Beatrice did not even bother addressing my cousin directly. She simply turned her head and looked over her shoulder at her son. Preston. Beatrice commanded her tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. We are leaving. Handle this immediately. Preston Harrington stepped out from the shadows near the grand staircase. He had spent the entire evening looking uncomfortable. Now, looking at the sobbing, fraudulent woman he had almost married, his expression hardened into pure disgust. He walked slowly toward Madison. Madison reached out to him, her tear-streaked face twisted in panic. Preston, baby, please, she begged, her voice high and grating. Do not listen to her. We love each other. The money does not matter. We can still get married. I will be a good wife, I promise. Preston stopped just out of her reach. He looked down at her with a cold expression that mirrored his mother's ruthless demeanor. The money absolutely matters when your entire relationship is built on a calculated financial scam, Preston stated, his voice devoid of warmth. You lied to me for 2 years, Madison. You lied about your background, your career, and your family. You are a complete, absolute fraud. He extended his right hand, keeping his palm flat and demanding. Give me the ring back, Madison. Right now. Madison gasped, clutching her left hand to her chest, as if protecting a vital organ. No, she wailed, shaking her head frantically. No, Preston, please. You gave this to me. We are supposed to be together. Give me the ring, he repeated, taking a firm step forward. If you do not hand it over this exact second, my family lawyers will have you arrested for grand larceny and fraud before midnight. Take it off. Defeated and humiliated, Madison slowly slid the massive diamond off her finger. Her hands shook violently as she dropped the heavy ring into his waiting palm. Preston did not say another word to her. He slipped the ring into his pocket, turned his back on the crying girl, and escorted his mother out the front doors. That was the final breaking point. The moment the Harrington family exited the mansion, the elite guests went into full panic mode. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family publicly branded as con artists by Beatrice Harrington. The wealthy socialites rushed toward the coat check room, pushing past one another to grab their jackets. It was a complete stampede of designer suits and silk gowns. The quiet whispers turned into loud, frantic demands for valet tickets. The grand foyer, buzzing with classical music just 10 minutes earlier, was now a chaotic disaster zone of fleeing guests. I stood near the podium and watched the mass exodus with profound satisfaction. Across the room, Richard watched his entire world crumble into dust. He had lost his mansion, his wealth, his social standing, and his absolute control over me. His mind could not process the total devastation. The aristocratic facade melted away, leaving only a furious man who needed someone to blame for his failures. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me, his face contorted with blinding, animalistic rage. You ruined everything! Richard bellowed, his voice raw and explosive. He lunged forward, pushing off the staircase railing. He charged directly across the marble floor, his fists clenched, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly as he aimed his body weight at me. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Before Richard could cross the midpoint of the grand foyer. Jamal moved with the speed and precision of a defensive lineman. My brother-in-law stepped directly into Richard's path. Jamal planted his feet, squared his broad shoulders, and met the charging older man with absolute force. Jamal caught Richard by the shoulders, stopping his momentum instantly. With a swift, powerful shove, Jamal overpowered the older man, throwing Richard backward. Richard stumbled wildly, his dress shoes slipping on the marble, and he crashed onto his back. Jamal stood towering over him, his dark eyes blazing with absolute protective fury. "Touch her one more time and I will have you arrested for assault on top of fraud," Jamal warned. The grand foyer of the Beacon Hill mansion, which just 20 minutes ago buzzed with the absolute pinnacle of Boston high society, was now entirely deserted. The heavy oak front doors remained wide open, letting the freezing night wind sweep through the expansive room. The imported white roses adorning the grand staircase already looked wilted, their sweet perfume overpowered by the bitter chill of reality. Discarded crystal champagne flutes littered the marble floors and mahogany side tables, abandoned in the frantic stampede of wealthy guests fleeing the scandal. The hired catering staff moved swiftly and silently in the background, hastily packing up their silver trays and mobile warming stations. They wanted to collect their equipment and leave this financial disaster zone as quickly as humanly possible. In the dead center of the room, stripped of their aristocratic audience, stood the ruins of my family. Richard leaned heavily against a marble pillar, his face buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic collapse of his fraudulent empire. Madison sat collapsed on the bottom step of the grand staircase, her expensive silk gown pooled around her in a wrinkled mess, her bare hands covering her tear-stained face as she hyperventilated. Patricia simply stared blankly at the empty space where Beatrice Harrington had delivered the fatal blow to her social standing. Her carefully pinned blonde hair was unraveling strands falling limply across her pale, stricken face. I stood near the entryway with Jamal by my side. He remained a steady, imposing presence, crossing his arms and watching the destruction of the people who had treated his wife and me like disposable assets. Mr. Stone, the bank representative, checked his watch and gave me a curt, professional nod. Right on cue. A white commercial van pulled into the circular driveway, parking directly behind my sleek sport utility vehicle. 4 burly private security contractors stepped out, followed closely by a professional locksmith carrying heavy tool bags. They walked past the retreating caterers and entered the grand foyer. The loud mechanical whir of a power drill shattered the heavy silence as the locksmith immediately began dismantling the ornate brass lock on the main front door. The grinding noise finally snapped Richard out of his catatonic state. He raised his head, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the security team. "What are they doing?" Richard demanded, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "You cannot do this right now. We need time to figure out a transition plan. We need a few days to secure a proper apartment." I looked at my father with absolute indifference. "You do not get a transition plan, Richard. The bank issued the default notice, and the property is officially under the control of the lending institution. The countdown I gave you was not a negotiation tactic. You have exactly 55 minutes left to pack your belongings before these gentlemen physically escort you off the premises." Patricia suddenly snapped out of her daze. She spun around, her eyes wide with a frantic, greedy desperation. She marched toward a display cabinet and reached for a heavy antique silver candelabra. "I will not leave empty-handed," Patricia hissed, grabbing the valuable silver piece. "We bought these things. They belong to us." One of the security contractors stepped forward instantly, placing a firm gloved hand over hers and effortlessly prying the silver candelabra from her trembling grip. He placed it back on the display cabinet and stepped between my mother and the valuables. "Leave it!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the cold air. "Every piece of high-value art, every antique, every piece of imported furniture, and every single silver spoon in this house legally belongs to the holding company. Those assets are actively being liquidated to cover the massive delinquent debt you recklessly accumulated. You are allowed to take exactly 2 suitcases each. You may pack your personal clothing, your basic toiletries, and nothing else. If you attempt to smuggle out so much as a designer watch or a diamond necklace, the bank will press additional charges for theft of corporate property." Madison let out a loud, pathetic wail from the stairs. 2 suitcases, she shrieked, her voice cracking. I have thousands of dollars worth of designer shoes in my closet. I cannot fit my life into 2 suitcases. Where am I even supposed to go tonight? My credit cards are completely frozen. Jamal looked down at Madison with sheer disgust. Then you better start prioritizing warm coats over high heels, Madison, Jamal stated firmly. And you better find a cheap motel that takes cash because the high society free ride is officially over. Realizing that tears and demands were utterly useless against a team of private security guards, the three of them finally scrambled up the grand staircase. For the next 40 minutes, the mansion echoed with the chaotic sounds of slammed drawers, frantic footsteps, and muffled arguments. I stood in the foyer reviewing the asset inventory clipboard with Mr. Stone, ensuring that the bank had a clear record of the property condition. Exactly on the hour, the security contractors escorted my family back down the stairs. Richard hauled 2 large rolling suitcases, his posture hunched and defeated. Madison dragged her bags behind her, her face blotchy and swollen from relentless crying. Patricia walked stiffly, clutching her 2 bags, her jaw locked in tight, stubborn defiance. The security team guided them toward the open front doors. The biting wind of the cold Boston night whipped into the foyer, a harsh welcome to their new reality. They stepped over the threshold and out onto the damp cobblestone driveway. The locksmith secured the new deadbolt on the heavy oak door, rendering their old keys completely useless. I stood on the front porch, pulling my wool coat tight against the bitter wind. I watched them shivering in the dark. They had nowhere to go tonight. As they were officially kicked out, Patricia broke down and she finally tried a new tactic. Exactly 1 week after the chaotic eviction at the Beacon Hill mansion, I sat in a sunlit corner booth at an upscale bistro overlooking the Boston Harbor. The atmosphere was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the financial and emotional hurricane my family had unleashed upon themselves. Sitting across from me were my older sister Nicole and her husband Jamal. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. Nicole looked completely different today. The tense, anxious energy she usually carried when trying to desperately appease our mother was entirely gone. Her posture was relaxed and she was smiling brightly. When Jamal delivered his ultimatum in my apartment hallway, Nicole had finally woken up. She chose her husband and her own sanity over the toxic demands of our parents. She had officially blocked their phone numbers the very next morning, severing their control. Jamal sat next to her, his protective arm resting comfortably behind her on the leather booth. He looked proud of the strong woman she was becoming now that she was completely free from the suffocating grip of Patricia and Richard. We were enjoying a quiet, elegant celebration of our newfound liberation, clinking our crystal glasses to a future without manipulation. As the waiter cleared our empty appetizer plates, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the polished wood of the table. I glanced down at the bright screen. It was a lengthy text message from a new, unrecognized phone number. However, the dramatic, victimized tone of the opening sentence immediately gave away the true identity of the sender. It was Patricia. Despite my previous stern warnings, my mother was attempting one final desperate maneuver to regain control. I picked up the phone and read the massive block of text. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She wrote that they were currently living in a cheap, unsanitary motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. She complained bitterly about the thin walls, the terrible food, and the absolute public humiliation of their new reality. Then, she quickly shifted the main focus to my cousin. She claimed that Madison was severely depressed, refusing to get out of bed because her billionaire fiancé had publicly dumped her and permanently canceled the wedding. Patricia begged me to show some basic human compassion. She pleaded for a generous monthly allowance, insisting that I owed them for raising me, and demanded I release enough funds to help them secure a respectable luxury apartment. She ended the message by declaring that a true, loving daughter would never let her own flesh and blood suffer in poverty. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sympathy as I read her pathetic, calculating plea. I simply let out a dry, humorless laugh that caught my sister's attention. I placed the phone directly in the center of the table and pushed it gently toward my sister. "Read this nonsense," I told her calmly. Nicole picked up the device. Jamal leaned in close to read the message right over her shoulder. I watched Nicole's face very carefully, waiting to see if the old toxic guilt would creep back into her expression. I watched her eyes scan the frantic, manipulative words. A week ago, a message exactly like this would have sent Nicole into a blind, terrifying panic. She would have been desperately trying to scrape together her own hard-earned savings to rescue our abusers. But today, she just shook her head in sheer absolute disgust. She is still using Madison to try and extract money from us, Nicole stated firmly, sliding the phone back across the table to me. Even after they lost absolutely everything, she is still actively prioritizing the golden child over her actual daughters. It is honestly pathetic to witness. I am so unbelievably glad I finally walked away from them. Jamal nodded in strong agreement, his expression rock solid. They dug their own financial grave, he added with a firm tone. Do not throw them a lifeline. They will just use it to try and drag you right down into the dirt with them. I smiled at both of them, deeply appreciative of their unwavering solidarity. I picked up my phone to deliver my final response. I did not write a long paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not justify my actions or argue about their past abuse. I simply typed 2 short sentences. Ask Madison to support you. She is the golden child, remember. I hit send. I watched the delivery notification appear on the screen, and then I permanently blocked the new number. The digital connection was severed instantly and forever. I slipped the phone back into my designer handbag, effectively erasing Patricia, Richard, and Madison from my daily existence. After finishing our delicious lunch and saying our warm, hopeful goodbyes, I drove straight to the sleek downtown office of my corporate attorney. The time had come to finalize the complete dismantling of the holding company. I walked into the glass-walled conference room and took a seat at the heavy marble table. My lawyer handed me a thick stack of official legal documents. These specific legal forms initiated the total complete liquidation of the limited liability company. The Beacon Hill estate had already been surrendered to the bank to satisfy the massive delinquent mortgage my parents had foolishly accumulated. Now I was officially dissolving the remaining corporate structure, entirely transferring the recovered legitimate capital directly into a private, heavily guarded personal trust. I picked up my gold-plated fountain pen. With steady, firm, deliberate strokes, I proudly signed my name on the final line of the last page. The ink dried quickly against the crisp white paper. I set the pen down gently, listening to the satisfying absolute silence of the quiet room. The corrupt corporate entity that had shielded my parents from federal prison and funded their arrogant lifestyle was officially dead. I had completely cut all financial ties to my toxic past, paving the way for my ultimate revenge. The crisp autumn air settled over Boston, bringing a profound sense of clarity that I had not felt in decades. The complete dissolution of the holding company was the final nail in the coffin of my parents' fraudulent empire. There were no more legal battles to fight, and no more late-night frantic messages to ignore. I had successfully severed the diseased branches of my family tree, and the resulting peace was absolutely intoxicating. My revenge was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, calculated withdrawal of my resources and protection, letting gravity do all the necessary heavy work. Without my pristine financial record shielding them from reality, my parents plummeted straight into the unforgiving consequences of their own actions. My father, Richard, the man who used to confidently order $500 bottles of wine at Michelin-starred restaurants, was now wearing a polyester uniform name tag. He secured a minimum-wage retail job at a local hardware store out in the distant suburbs. He spent his days organizing boxes of nails and directing customers to the plumbing aisle, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarchal authority. The country club elites he once tried to impress completely ignored him. Patricia fared no better in her new impoverished reality. She was forced to abandon her designer gowns and high society galas, trading them for the cramped confines of a cheap rented apartment she shared with Richard. Her former socialite friends treated her like a contagious disease, actively crossing the street to avoid making eye contact whenever she ventured into the city. Madison experienced the most spectacular fall from grace. Her carefully curated aristocratic social media presence died completely overnight. She deleted all her online profiles, unable to face the relentless public humiliation after her wealthy fiancé ruthlessly dumped her forever. Instead of shopping at luxury boutiques on Newberry Street, my cousin was now working grueling double shifts at a busy coffee shop, desperately trying to pay off her massive credit card debt. She had no trust fund and no rich husband to rescue her from the overwhelming financial ruin she created. While they struggled to survive the harsh reality of minimum wage labor, my own life skyrocketed in the exact opposite direction. The executive board at my financial firm recognized the flawless execution of the complex corporate audits I handled, resulting in a massive promotion for me this past week. That major promotion came with a massive compensation package and an unprecedented level of professional authority. I was no longer the quiet daughter typing in a cubicle. I was a respected leader in the corporate financial sector. With my new executive income and the legitimate capital recovered from the liquidated corporate holding company, I purchased a stunning modern penthouse right in the heart of downtown Boston. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city's skyline. It was a sleek, secure fortress of my own making, standing far away from the toxic past. The expansive penthouse featured a beautiful open-concept kitchen and a grand dining area perfect for hosting the people who actually deserved a seat at my table. That brings us to Thanksgiving. The evening was crisp and beautiful. The rich, savory smell of roasted turkey and fresh herbs filled my luxurious apartment. I was not spending this holiday being insulted or treated like a human automated teller machine. I was surrounded by genuine warmth and mutual respect. I set the heavy mahogany dining table with elegant gold-plated silverware and pristine white porcelain plates, pouring my expensive red wine freely. Sitting across from me at the gorgeous table was my sister Nicole. She looked incredibly radiant and genuinely happy for the very first time in her adult life. The heavy burden of constantly trying to appease our narcissistic parents had completely vanished from her features. She wore a simple, beautiful dress and laughed freely, her eyes bright and clear. Beside her sat Jamal, his broad shoulders relaxed as he smiled at his wife. He had always been a brilliant structural engineer and an unapologetic protector of peace. Choosing his marriage over my parents' toxic manipulation had completely saved their relationship. Jamal reached over and gently squeezed Nicole's hand, resting on the polished wood of the dining table. The dark, rich tone of his skin contrasted beautifully with the crisp white linen napkins. They were actively healing together, building a strong, loving foundation for the future children they planned to have. They had both officially changed their phone numbers, completely cutting off any remaining avenues of communication with Patricia and Richard. We were three independent, successful adults who had successfully escaped a sinking ship. We did not spend our evening complaining about the toxic people who had tried to destroy us. Instead, we talked about our future goals, our upcoming travel plans, and the professional milestones we were actively achieving. I looked around my beautiful home, absorbing the deep, unshakable sense of security I had built with my own two hands. I picked up my crystal glass filled with a rare vintage wine that cost more than Richard now made in an entire month of manual labor. I held the glass up, catching the warm golden light of the modern chandelier hanging directly above us. Jamal and Nicole raised their glasses in unison, their faces glowing with profound gratitude and triumph. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the rich wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked out the massive glass windows at the glittering lights of Boston, reflecting on the dark waters of the harbor below. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life through this grueling ordeal. Family is absolutely not defined by blood if that blood is entirely toxic and abusive. True power is never about actively trying to destroy the malicious people who hurt you. True power is having the absolute strength to turn your back and walk away forever.